on April 11th, 1988. This is Ruth Lesly for the Hastings Oral History Project on April 11th, 1988. Okay, I'm with Frank Waryha at the cottage, and he's going to tell me about some of the early days on the waterfront. Do you want to start by telling me when and where you were born, Frank?
Yeah, I was born here in Hastings at Division Street. The house is still standing, and it belongs to the Sedinsky family, and they still own it.
Okay, let's Frank, did you work at the waterfront at all?
No,
or,
no.
Did your father or your brother?
My father worked at the Anaconda, and then my brother Bill and my brother Charles worked at the Anaconda.
What years did your father work there?
That was in the early 30s, like about 1931. Because he didn't get along too well with the Anaconda, and he got a job at the carpet shops in Yonkers. So we moved to Yonkers about 1931, and every time my father would come home at night and say, "Where is the family?" Mother would say, "They're all in Hastings." So he gave up his job in the carpet shop, and we moved back to Hastings.
That certainly is indicative of your feelings about Hastings. When he was working there, were you aware of other waterfront industries?
Oh yes, the Zinsser Company, because Zinsser at Christmas time used to be very generous with the poor. They used to donate toys, and they dressed someone up as a Santa Claus, and they came and knocked on the door, and there was Santa Claus with a big bag of toys. And I remember the toys that the family got. My younger sister got a doll. I got a Greyhound bus. My younger brother got a Fifth Avenue bus with a balcony. My brother Charles got an Erector set, and my brother Bill got a train set, Lionel train set.
Can you give me any kind of a picture of what waterfront looked like during the time that your father worked there?
Not really, because we lived on Ridge, and we used the Warburton entrance more or less, and I had just started school. I was 5 at the time. We had moved down to Warburton because my father opened a butcher shop, and we lived upstairs. That was right on Warburton. And then he lost the butcher shop, and we moved to the back, which was 24 Ridge Street. The building is torn down since then. But I do remember one morning, about 3 o'clock in the morning, we were awakened by the room being lit up. There was a fire down at the pavement company. And we went out to the back porch, and we sat there watching the fire, and we could hear the firemen shouting up to us and so on. So the next day we were taken down to see the results of the fire. That was, I think, the pavement company, if I'm not mistaken. And of course we all remember the Zinzers because the smokestack was Zinsser written on it. I think that's gone. Long time.
What kind of work did your father do at Anaconda?
I have no idea. I really don't have any idea. It was just, he was a laborer, more or less. The way they hired the men, the people who just came over, the immigrants, was you went down to the hiring office, and the man would come out in the morning and say, you, and you. And they just took them all in. The others all left.
That wasn't day work, that was for a permanent job?
Whatever, for permanent jobs. And the next morning, again, the same troop would go down until they were chosen. And others would join them, and they would bring their brothers, or they would bring their other members of the family, and the man would come out and say, you, and so on. So we never knew what my father did except that he was a laborer.
Did you know if his job was dangerous at all? Was that ever talked about in the house?
I think most of them talked about the danger there, because it was they were not used to all this machinery and mechanism. So they were all farmers in Russia. so that they weren't used to this. And I remember my father coming home exhausted and saying that they were frightened to death of the machinery.
Was he ever injured?
No, not that I know of.
Were you aware of the financial situation in your family? For example, would you have known if he'd gotten bonuses for doing anything special?
No, but I know the financial. We never knew we were poor. I mean, we got our meals, we got regular meals and so on. But we did know as children that when Papa got paid, we had meat, which was usually like a hamburger and the chicken in the pot on Sunday. When he didn't get paid, we had mashed potatoes and buttermilk. Mother would make a sort of a milk drop soup where she dropped little dumplings of flour into hot milk, and we had that. But I do remember we had chicken every Sunday.
Proverbial. Did your father wear a uniform or any special
No, it was
clothing?
just laborers, because Mom was always complaining about having to wash the clothing. And then when things were so bad, all these people took in boarders. The young men would come from Europe and need a place to stay, so they were given a room in your apartment, and they would eat with the family, and Mother would wash all their clothes and so on.
Did your family have such
Oh
boarders?
yes, we had boarders. We
Uh-huh.
had boarders. I remember Mama talking about the boarders and how she slaved over the laundry and how dirty the clothing was, and of course they had the washboard, to do and so on. And all these women would gather in the backyard and do the washing and hang it out.
Do you have any idea how your father felt about the work? Did he enjoy it?
He never mentioned, except that he was always very tired. That was the only thing. And if he had any complaints, he didn't talk about it to us. He talked about to Mother, in privacy.
Yeah.
But I do remember he had to get up very early while it was still dark, and Mama would be making his breakfast at the coal stove. And then when we woke up, the remnants of the breakfast were still at the table and so on, and Mom was getting our breakfast ready. So he got up while it was dark, that I remember.
Were there very long hours at the
I think they were.
Was he home for dinner, for example, when you...
He would come home for lunch. I remember when it was awfully hot, and Mama, one of the poor days was she had soup, and it was a bouillon, more or less. I don't know what else was put in, just the meat stock, more or less, and very, very hot. And she pulled the shade down to keep the sun out, and here with these bowls of hot soup, she was waiting to cool off because he was coming home for lunch. But there's always black bread, pumpernickel black bread, or the Jewish rye, whatever they call it. That was always filling.
Did your mother make that, or did they buy it?
No, she used to buy it. She used to buy it. But she would make the soup because we had the coal stove. Even in the hottest days in summer, that coal stove was always going. We didn't have gas.
Do you think the workers, your father and his cohorts, were aware of the river? Did they use it? I mean, you said your father came home for lunch, so he didn't...
No, I don't know whether they bathed down there after work in the river. I don't know much about that, except I know my father didn't like the type of work because of the machinery. Later on, when he left there, and he left the carpet shop, he went into gardening. That was more his forte.
Excuse me. Did he ever talk about the working conditions there?
No, as I say, if he did, he just mentioned to Mama. We were too young at the time. We were too young to... I was not even 5 years old yet.
You said also that your brothers went to work there. When did they go to work
They
there?
went when they left school. Both of them. Charles was a dropout before even graduating junior high.
These older brothers?
These older brothers. And Bill went to Saunders Trade for a while, and then he was a dropout there, and then he went to work with the Anaconda.
Do you have any idea about what year it might have been for them?
Oh, it was 1930, 34, 35, 35, something like that.
Do you know what they did when they worked there?
No, I
Yeah.
couldn't tell you, except that Charles used to mention that they worked where they made the cables. They put the cable together in the spinner, they called it. And they found that a very dangerous instrument. A man was caught in the spinner and just chopped to pieces.
Ooh.
You know, it was, I remember the ambulance and the sirens and so on, and all the people in that department were sent home. And my brother came home and was describing, they said they had to shovel the man together in a basket. He was caught in the spinner. So it was dangerous work.
So indeed there were industrial accidents.
Oh.
Did you know of others besides this terrible one you spoke of?
I can't remember any accidents. Of course, we were not told too much about that. We didn't dwell on it. Being children, you know, they just kept it from us.
How did your brothers go to work? They walked?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and your father walked to work also? You
Yes.
lived right nearby?
We lived, at the time they went to work there, we lived at 3 Washington, which was right across the street from the Anaconda. That's when they went to work there. Meanwhile, Bill, the older brother, came to work here at the Snyder estate, doing errands and whatever, gardening, helping in the gardening, because my sister Ann worked here. She worked here as more or less a maid, serving and so on, because when the family were out, my sister would bring us to the house to see the house and so on. So we knew where the kitchen was and so on.
About what time was that she worked there? Do you have any idea?
That was around 1928, 1927, 1928, 1929. And then when they needed extra help, like errands, she brought my brother Bill along, and he would come and do the errands, maybe cut the grass, things like that. You'd have to ask my brother Bill to find out what he did. But Ann worked more or less as a maid.
So Bill left Anaconda. Did Charles stay there?
Oh, no. Bill didn't leave the Anaconda.
Oh, he did this.
This was just part-time,
I
like
see.
Saturdays and Sundays and off hours or holidays or so on.
Did they both continue to work there then?
They both continued to work at the Anaconda, yes, until they closed the Anaconda. So both brothers were working there.
Oh, for many years.
Charles did not get the pension, but Bill worked there long enough to get the pension. So they both worked there until it closed.
Was there a retirement dinner, or did they do anything like that?
No. The closing was very bitter. The closing was very bitter because they found out that they were closing, and immediately that meant their jobs. And then they found out that they were not going to get a pension. That added to the bitterness. Oh, no, it was not a happy occasion at all.
How many years did you have to work there to get a pension? Because it sounded like...
Well, Bill will tell you that, because he will tell you how many years he worked there, which was longer than Charles. Bill gets the pension because he worked there, I think, 35 years. And Charles didn't work quite that long, and he just, under the road, didn't collect any pension.
Thinking in terms of both your brothers and your father, did your family feel a loyalty to the company?
I don't think they felt anything toward the company. It was just a job. It was just paying the money, and they had a job. I don't think they felt anything toward it. It was just a job. I think so.
Was your father working there during World War I, or it was later that he started?
Oh, no, it was later. It was, I think, they didn't come over until after the war.
I see.
I forget what year they arrived here. They arrived with my sister in tow. She was 5 years old at the time, and I don't know what year that was. And an older brother, Joseph, was to come over with them, but he acquired scarlatina, so they would not let him over. So he was left with an aunt and uncle in Russia. But Anne came over, and I remember her saying when she was 5 years old.
And the three boys were all You and Bill and Charles were all born here?
Yes. Joe and Ann were born in Russia.
Do you know anything about the union organization at Anaconda?
Nothing.
Your father didn't belong to the union?
It was before the union.
And he had become a gardener by the time the union
He had,
started?
more or less. I think the union came in the late 30s, if I'm not mistaken.
Did your brothers belong to the union?
I believe they did, yes.
Did they ever talk about it, or?
Not really.
That-
Not really. They just talked about, the one time I remember they were talking about going out on strike. And they didn't want to go out on strike because they meant they wouldn't get any money. But they did go along because it was a strike.
Did the union provide any money for
That I
those?
couldn't tell you.
Yeah.
That I couldn't tell you.
Do you know anything about whether there were workers who really were opposed to the union altogether?
No, that I couldn't tell you.
Okay, well, we'll leave the union alone then. Okay. Do you want to tell me the different places that you lived? You've mentioned you lived on Ridge Street and then Washington Avenue. Were there any others?
Well, yes, we shifted around quite a bit. I don't know why we moved so often. Maybe the money, maybe the rent, whatever. But I was born in the Sedinsky house on Division Street. And my younger brother and I were born there. My sister and other brother were born on Ridge Street. So we were more or less around that section.
Your sister, you had two sisters?
2 sisters.
So there were 6 children altogether?
7.
7.
Then we moved, my father acquired the butcher shop, and it was half grocery and butcher shop. My sister Ann worked as a clerk in the store at the time, and my mother worked as a clerk. My father was the butcher. And we lived upstairs. Then they lost the butcher shop. I think they went bankrupt. I never heard the full story about it. And we moved in the back of the house, of the store. And it was more or less an old stagecoach alley, because as we had to come into the building, there were cobblestones all the way up to the door.
Now, this was on what street?
24 Ridge Street. The building is torn down, but at that time I thought it was more or less laborers' quarters or whatever it was, I don't know. But it had the cobblestones in until you got up to, say, the front door of the apartment. And there were stairs upstairs. There were other people living upstairs. So that was 24 Ridge Street. And then we moved to Nepperhan Avenue in Yonkers. We moved 3 times when we lived in Yonkers. And as I say, we loved Hastings, and we came back to Hastings. When we came back, we moved to 3 Washington Avenue. We lived there for a while until Mr. Selsda, who was the landlord, was going to renovate, and we had to get out. So we moved up to 405 Warburton, which is called the Irish Flats. We lived there for a while. And then we moved to the corner of Williams and Warburton, the small apartment house there. And then Mama, with the 2 boys, moved to 542 Warburton, which is now the Bollinger Plaza. There used to be a house there. And in front of that house on the Main Street entrance used to be the church. And they rolled that church all the way up to the hollow. And I remember when we used to go to school, we used to climb over the rollers. And here was this church, sat in the middle of Main Street.
How long did it sit there?
It sat there until they raised more money for the contractor to move it some more. It was during the Depression. And they didn't have enough money. So when they ran out of money, the contractor just left it until they raised more money. When they got more money, he moved the church.
In the different apartments that you lived in, did your family have the rights to the yard? Did you have a garden or grow any vegetables?
No, not really. My father took on gardening after a while, and they separated. So Mom was left with the brood. That was when we moved to Washington Avenue. It wasn't until really that we moved to Warburton that we had access to part of the parking lot, and she made a garden there.
Mm-hmm.
And she found out she loved gardening.
What did she grow?
Flowers mostly. And then she grew a few tomatoes. And but it was just tomatoes, but mostly flowers. And whenever anyone came to visit, she would give them a bouquet of flowers to take home. Then when I bought the house up on Farragut, of course we had more room, so she had flowers all over, and then she experimented with vegetables too. But she took over gardening, and my father was a gardener. Of course they were separated, but he went on to different estates helping and cutting the grass and so on. Sometimes grabbing me on Saturday to come rake the grass and so on, which we didn't like very much. The pay was terrible. 15 cents a day was hardly what you would call pay. Slave labor.
You mentioned that in your early apartment, I guess the Ridge Street one, there were boarders. Did you continue to have
there
boarders?
were no boarders there. There were no boarders there.
Where were you living when there were boarders?
Before we moved to the city, before I was born.
Oh, I see. There were no longer any there.
No, we didn't have any boarders that I remember when I was born. But I remember Mama talking over the years about, he was a boarder here, and he was a boarder here, and he was a boarder at so-and-so's, and he was a boarder at your uncle's, and so on. So they all took these young men who came over from Russia, and they would say, we need a room, for so-and-so's brother is coming from Russia, and so on. And then when they were established here, they would send for the wife and the rest of the family, and they would find their own apartments. Mm-hmm. But that was the boarders.
Was there ever a discussion in the house about in the apartments, about wanting to buy a house, about owning land?
Well, when we had the butcher shop, I remember this, my sister talking about it later on when I bought the house on Farragut, her mother having nervousness about buying the house and whether we could keep it and so on. And Anne saying to Mother, when we had the butcher shop and we were pulling in money, we could have bought a house on Marble Terrace. But evidently they weren't too interested in spending the money on the house. Mm-hmm. So we did want a house at the time. And if it had gone through, probably still be living there.
Before your family had the butcher shop, when your father was still working, did your mother work outside of the home too?
No, because we were too small. Mm-hmm. There was myself, and then there was a younger brother, and we were, he was 2 and I was 4. And I do remember the house, because I mentioned to Mother a few times, and she would say, but you can't remember, you were too young. And I would say, yes, I remember Tony, and she said, well, after that we moved down to the butcher shop, on Warburg. And I said, I do remember the building, and I remember how shy we were. 2 brothers. When a friend of the family came to visit, she would try to get us out. We would hide behind the columns and so on. And I would mention this to Mother, and she'd say, you couldn't remember, you were too young. And I do remember when we had the butcher shop and we lived above it, the doorknob was so high up that Mama put a necktie on, and when I wanted to open the door, I had to pull the necktie.
Oh,
that's how small I was.
Since you do remember, can you tell me something about what the apartment looked like? How many rooms there were? How many people shared a bedroom?
When we lived over the butcher shop, I do remember that we had the laundry tubs in the kitchen, and laundry tubs in the kitchen. I don't remember too much. I do remember Mama had the sewing machine in one room, and that was more or less like a party room. My father played the violin, and at Christmas time he would play Silent Night, which always brought tears to my eyes. I would cry terribly. And then when he played a polka, my sister would dance with the children, and so there was the hobby room, and there was where I slept with my younger brother. And I do remember the 2 tubs in the kitchen. because my sister used to bathe us. We were so small, she bathed us in the tubs in the kitchen instead of the bathroom.
Mm-hmm.
Then when we moved down to, that was, I would say about 5 rooms. Then when we moved down to 24 Ridge, it was just 3 rooms. And we all had to sort of sleep layer fashion. And my parents had the front room, which was more or less the parlor as well. They had that room. And all of us were in the back room, which was the bedroom, more or less.
And how many were you at that time?
There were 5 of us.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know where Anne slept, really. I think she more or less slept in the kitchen. I don't know, because I do remember her coming home after coming in late, and my father sitting there making a tombstone and asking her where she was, and I don't know her reply. And
What do you mean by making a tombstone?
Oh, he was a tombstone maker. He made tombstones as well. He was quite prolific.
Oh.
He was quite talented in many ways. He made tombstones which are still standing in St. Joseph's Cemetery. And then the old-fashioned thing with the grave, when they had the cement sides, he would make those too.
And he did this at home?
He did this at home after
industry.
hours, yes. I remember he sat in the corner, and he cast the cement and the crucifix on the top of the tombstone, and then he would be putting the letters and chiseling the letters out.
Did he ever teach any of your children to do that?
No, we were too small.
Even the older boys?
I don't remember his teaching the older boys, but we were too small at the time. We were going to school. But I do remember my father begrudging the fact that we had to go to school, because when we were his age, when he was our age, he was behind a plow in Russia. And Mama kept saying, "You're not in Russia now, you're in America." She was very pro-American, and he was very pro-Russian. And we used to think, well, why doesn't he go back to Russia if he was so happy there?
Did you learn to speak Russian?
We spoke Russian at home.
You spoke it at home?
We spoke Russian at home. And more or less, we spoke English with the rest of the children, because they were all going to school, so we picked up. And the background is Polish, so we spoke Polish as well.
How old were you when you learned English?
I think more or less when I first started to speak.
Yes.
It was both English and Russian and Polish.
Oh, my.
Oh, yeah, we were quite busy. I remember we would go to school and we would mix some of the Polish or the Russian with the English, because we didn't know the word in English. So, in fact, when Anne, who was the oldest, took my brother, at the time, his name was Alexander. His name is not William. It was Alexander. She took him to school on his first day, and they wanted to register him. She couldn't spell Alexander, so she said his name is William. So that's where he got the name William.
That's wild. Tell me a little bit about the neighborhood. What did you consider your neighborhood?
Well, the neighborhood I remember mostly was behind the butcher shop and 24 Ridge Street. Because Ridge Street, when I visited, about a year ago or so, I bumped into George Koshin, who still owns one of the houses there. And as I passed, I was looking around, and so I'm trying to remember what was here. And George called out of the car and said, "It hasn't changed that much, Frank." And I looked, and he said, "Do you think it's changed?" And I said, "Yes, there are garages here." Well, in those days, we didn't have cars, so there were no garages. But I do remember what this looked like and that looked like and so on. So I think that Ridge Street, which is right off Washington, that whole section was our growing up period and our neighborhood.
How far from the house were you allowed to go when you were small?
Well, we were on Ridge Street. There were no cars there, so we were allowed the whole street.
Mm-hmm. But you didn't go off Ridge Street?
No. In fact, that's how my younger brother Anthony was killed. My sister was left as babysitter, and we don't know how it happened. I won't go into that. But they ran out onto Warburton, and he was the last one to run across, and the car came and killed him. So he was 3 years old, going on 4 in the month. That was in 1928. And I had just started kindergarten at the time.
What ethnic groups lived in your neighborhood?
Oh, we were quite a mixture. Oh, we were very mixed. In fact, as children, we spoke Russian, we spoke Polish, and there were Italians, I remember. There were Portuguese. There were the Irish. That's why the Warburton, there was apartments on Warburton called the Irish Flats, because that was the Irish section. And then the Polish more or less moved up around there as well. The Sabdinskis lived on Division. So it was quite ethnic. It was quite a mixture.
Do you remember the names of people who lived on your block?
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah.
Tell me.
A lot of them. There was the Shapura family, which they lived at 26, which was next door. And Mrs. Shapura was our first babysitter. Shall I tell you about how I learned to tie my shoes? When
Sure.
She came in the morning because she wasn't working at the time. She had children of her own the same age. Mama had to go to work. So Mrs. Shapura would come to the house and Mother would be rushing to get to work. And of course they had to tie our shoes. And I sat there and waited for Mrs. Shapura to dress my younger brother. And I got so impatient, I got the shoelaces together and tied it. And I was so proud of the fact I learned how to tie my own shoelace. So you can imagine how young we were at the time.
Yes.
But there was Shapuras, and then there were the Malyanowskis, there were the Muriks, there were the Wokes, there were the Friedrichs, and further down on Ridge were the Sminskys, the Yevchaniks, the Vazaks. There were the Jutkowskis, Ravinskys, the Tamuks. See if I can get all of them. And the Kutzap. They call them QCAP now, but at the time they were Kutzap. There were the Filipoviches. I remember when Mrs. Filipovich died, and it was right on Ridge Street. Who else lived there? That was, then there were, we call them Kirilla. I forget what they're called in English. The Kirillas, and they had a little store right next to it's a storehouse now. It was a little store, grocery store. And we used to run down there for emergency things like sugar or flour or whatever it was.
Your family didn't shop there regularly? Where would they have done their regular shopping?
The store that took over. The store that took over from our butcher shop was a grocery store. That was on Toshik's grocery store. They took over there, the butcher shop. So we shopped there more or less. They never came over the bridge to the A&P of the store. So we're here, we shopped more or less
In the
neighborhood. Right.
Was there any kind of a social meeting place in your neighborhood where your parents would get together?
Oh, yes. That was the, we called Sigazitsky's Hall on, I think it's 10 Washington Avenue. Mm-hmm. And it's still there, but it's a factory now, I think. But that's where all the social events took place. Weddings, dances of all kind, when they had the ethnic dances. The Italians would have it one time, and then the Russians would have it another time. And then they would have a wedding, and the reception was there. Oh yes, that was quite the social place. We all remember, we call, instead of Sigazitsky's, we call it skis. And that's where most of the things were. And anyone who lived in that section will always very fondly tell you about Skis Hall. The Russian club had, Saturday mornings they had Russian school teaching Russian to the children, Russian teachers.
Did you go?
No, because we weren't Russian. We were Polish, more or less. But you see, we were Polish heritage. My parents were born in Minsk, which was Poland at the time. But at the time my parents were born, it was taken over by Russia. It became Russian land. So that made them Russian, you see, more or less.
Uh-huh.
But the heritage is Polish. The name is Polish. It means ladle.
Ah.
It's pronounced Waryha. There should be a C-H-A there. But I think when they came over with their passports, they probably thought the C was a curlicue and left it out.
You mentioned the grocery store in the neighborhood. Were there other stores? What other kinds of services were there in the neighborhood?
I really don't remember too much. There weren't too many stores. The stores more or less were on Warburton and on Washington. Much later, when we moved from Yonkers to Washington, then we found out that there was Kalina's Market, where the bookstore is now, and right across where the other bookstore is was what they called the Russian Cooperative Butcher Shop.
Oh, tell me about that.
That was a grocery and a butcher shop. And they were very, very successful. I don't know why they went out of business. It was one half of they were two stores, then they knocked out a partition, and more or less there were steps up to the butcher shop. And the grocery store was on the bottom half. And when you went in, you brought your little book with you, the credit book. And they wrote down whatever you bought. They wrote it down in indelible pencil. I remember they always put the pencil on their tongues to wet it so that no one could erase it. And then on Saturday nights, after Papa got paid, you would take the book into, and they would add up and tell you how much you owed. That's the way we bought. But there was Kalina's Market, which was right next to 10 Washington, and the Russian Cooperative, which was right across the street.
Why was it called cooperative? Was
because
it
it was a cooperative. It was a bunch of Russian men, the Russian club that met in skis. They took it over, and they ran it quite well. They had quite a selection of groceries. You could find almost everything there.
Do you know when that closed?
I have no idea. I have no idea, because when we moved away from, more or less away from Warburton and Williams, and we moved over to 542 Warburton, it was more or less a different environment entirely. So I don't remember when they went out of business.
You shopped in different places then when you
We
moved?
shopped in different places, and yes. There was the A&P, which is where the market is now on Warburton. And then there was the dairy shop, which is now the shoe store on the corner of Main and Warburton. That was the dairy, eggs, butter, and so on, where they sold butter in the big tubs. And they sold sugar loosely and eggs loosely and so on. And then there was a James Butler store, which is where the Green Tavern is now. That was a James Butler. And
what kind of a store was that?
that was grocery.
Uh-huh.
That was more or less like Gristides, more or less like Gristides was. They were a little more expensive because they carried White Rose products, which were quality. I remember White Rose because that was very ritzy when you used White Rose products.
And did your mother shop there since?
No. I shopped there more or less when I worked for Father Daskowitz. When my father worked for Father Daskowitz as a gardener, I was brought along to do errands and clip grass around the edges and so on. And Father Daskowitz would tell me to go to Gristides, or I think it was Gristides, which was on Warburton, or the James Butler stores.
Did the area of town, say when you lived on Ridge Street, did that section have a name? Did you call it anything?
No, it was just, we used to call it Rich Street. We were so proud of the fact that it was Rich Street. Oh, we live on Rich Street. We were all very rich. As I say, we didn't know we were poor. We had a very, very enjoyable childhood. We weren't told that we were wearing rags. We weren't told that we were wearing cast-offs. And so the clothes that we were given, we just wore. We didn't know we were poor until we got to the school. And then we ran into what we call the rich kids, who reminded us that we were wearing rags and cast-offs and so on. But otherwise, amongst ourselves, we were all a happy bunch. I remember when you had to go to a neighbor, the door was never locked. You just rapped on the door and opened the door and walked in. And that was it, with no keys, only when you went away. And the key was put under the mat.
We'll talk more about school because I'm really interested in that. But I just want to finish up with your family. You said there were 7. Your oldest brother never came.
No, he never came. He didn't.
But there were 6 of you then?
Yeah, he came when we were living in Yonkers. Then the family raised the money to bring him over.
Oh, so he did get
In 1932, he came over.
Did were any of your grandparents here, or did
No.
you have aunts or
No.
uncles?
My
or-
grandfather died fairly young. My grandmother lived up until World War II. She was like 102 or so. And we were sent a picture, which I still have, of Grandma. I don't know who the other woman is in the picture. But during the beginning of the war, when they were having such a tough time, we never heard how she died or when. We never had word from them after that.
Were there any aunts or uncles? Did any other?
There was an aunt who took care of Joe when he was left, the aunt and an uncle. I never heard anything about them after he
But
left.
none came here?
Oh, no, no.
Uh-huh.
There were, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting about Uncle Benny, Ben Waryha. They lived on Washington Avenue, and in the early 30s, he was burned to death. Kerosene can he was carrying, he poured it onto the stove, onto the wood, and the wood was lit already and exploded.
Mm-hmm.
And he ran. He had the bathrobe on. He ran down the stairs. He was aflame, and so on. And he died in the hospital in the evening. That was Uncle Ben, and then there was an Uncle Frank.
These were your father's brothers?
My father's brothers. Uncle Frank, who my father was not easy to get along with. My father was a very, very difficult person. He and Frank did not get along together. He didn't get along with Ben, his brother Ben. And then there were stepbrothers. And stepbrother was the Downer family. They were Adam Downer and I forget what his name was. Another Downer. No relation to Josephine Downer.
Oh.
There was another Downer family. Now the Downer family I'm talking about were Adam Downer, who died recently, and his brothers were Stanley and Joe. Now they're all dead, and the mother died, and the oldest sister Emma, who was Emma Boris, she died. This is all just recently in the past few years, but Adam was the last of that family to die. And now the other Downer, most of them were, they lived over the florist, or in Hastings here, they lived over. There was Mary, there was Helen, who became Helen Breckles, and there was Mary Grower, when she married, was Grower. There was Bernard, who was the older boy. There was Frank, who's my contemporary. And there was Anna, who died very young in Grasslands Hospital. So they were stepbrothers with my father. See? So we were all related that way.
And were there family gatherings?
No, more or less. My father was sort of very difficult that way. He was very friendly with people like Mr. and Mrs. Hryniusz. Now they're both deceased, the daughter's deceased, and so on. But I have the wedding picture of Mr. and Mrs. Hryniusz, where Mama is holding my brother Bill, who was very, very young at the time. So I have that wedding picture to show you. And Anne was always in the wedding pictures. And when I asked Jean Taneski, why was she always a bridesmaid? And they said, well, she was so much fun. She was very, very lively, and she loved everyone. Everyone loved her, and she was a great deal of fun at weddings and christenings and so on. Because I have all these pictures of her at weddings and so on, bridesmaids and so on. I think that's about all the cousins and so on. But Father picked on most of his friends as friends of the family.
Mm-hmm.
And I do remember Mr. and Mrs. Hryniusz were very, very close friends. I forget some of the other people. But when people came to the house, they were more or less distant people who were friends of the family years before. They used to come from Brooklyn.
Mm.
Our cousins from Brooklyn are here. And one of the very dear friends was, I don't know what his last name was, Piotrek. He was my sister Mary's godfather. And Sophie Reynolds, who's now Sophie Reynolds, she was a Poli at the time. She was my godmother. And my Uncle Frank was my godfather. But they were more or less not the cousins and the relations that got together. It seems families didn't care for the other families. We were more or less a little close to Ben Waryha because we lived so close together. But I don't remember ever, big gatherings, so I don't know who was there when we did entertain.
What kinds of family activities did you have? What would you say were the most important?
The family activities? I don't remember, except that things were so... we didn't have anything. In those days, we didn't have a radio. We didn't have anything like that. We couldn't afford an automobile or bicycles. And I don't remember, except that we were very happy as kids.
Yeah, that's great.
I remember when I was a latchkey kid, when I came home from school, the key was not under the mat, it was in the mailbox. And I would have to get a stool, which was in the hallway, and reach up into the mailbox. I was a latchkey kid, and I came home and I had to entertain myself because my mother was working and she wasn't home.
What about your younger brother?
But he died. He died at that time.
Of course, you told me
Yeah.
that. How many members of the family worked when?
There was, my mother went to work as a domestic. My father worked in the Anaconda. And Anne worked.
Mm-hmm.
Anne worked. I understand when Anne graduated school, she went to work for R.H. Macy's. And she left there, and I don't know if she worked in between that time. But the next thing I knew, she was at the Stein-Snyder estate as a maid. I don't know how they took her on, or, well, perhaps Barbara can enlighten me there. Barbara or Beatrice, the Stein-Snyder girls.
How long did she work there?
For years.
Yes.
She worked there for years, and then she went into the phone company.
Mm-hmm. Do you know when that was?
That must have been in the early 30s.
Mm-hmm.
In the early 30s, because she was working there at 27, 28. So she was there at the house. So it must have been very early in the 30s that she went into the phone company.
Did she live at home all this time?
No.
No.
She moved out. She lived out.
Mm-hmm.
We had problems. We had problems with my father. We had problems with Mother. And she was the type that she couldn't cope with the family problems, so she would move out, live with other people.
Mm-hmm. Were there any other families that you socialized with? You mentioned, now I'm very bad at pronouncing, Hryniusz? You said...
Hryniusz.
Okay. Were there other families in the neighborhood that you socialized with?
Well, we socialized mostly a lot with the Shapuras. We were very, very friendly with the Shapuras. I remember when Mike was born and they had the christening, and we were invited to the christening. Being children, we ran about and so on. We ate and ran about. And then there were the Wilmers. They lived in the apartment building adjoining the Shapuras. They lived in that building, and I remember when Jean Wilmers, that's Jean Taneski, when her mother married for the second time, and they had the wedding reception in the Shapura house. Now, my sister was a bridesmaid, and Mrs. Kajura, who lived on Spring Street, they had the butcher shop there.
Sophie Kajura? Is that...
Oh, no, this is the mother.
Wasn't that Sophie?
She could have been Sophie. Everybody was Sophie. My mother was Sophie, Miss Shaputa was Sophie. We had so many Sophies. But she was a bridesmaid, too. And I remember the reception as the Shaputas had a garden there. They came through the garden reception, and we were throwing rice on them. And then I remember when Mike was born, they had the christening there. So we did socialize with the Shaputas, with the Hrenyushes, with the Turoskis. That's Bessie Sahar now.
Oh.
That's her maiden name was Bessie Turoski. And we socialize with the Tamuks. That's
Bernice's family?
Bernice's family. The reason I remember the Tamuks is we didn't socialize so much as her uncle or cousin, a member of the family, had Tamuks saloon, which was right down next to Ski's Hall. It's now called Susie's or whatever it is. It's tavern. Well, the owner always smoked very heavy Turkish cigarettes, and I found out from Emily they were Camels, but they were very, very heavy, the smoke. And he just puffed away, and he said, he played the cimbalum on Sunday afternoons. He played the cimbalum. My father played the violin and what they call the bubin, which was a tambourine with the hand beating. And Mr. Hrenyush, who was always drunk, played the accordion. And they would practice their playing, the orchestra, the three-piece orchestra. And they just played. And since my father was babysitting for me, I had to sit through all this.
Didn't you enjoy it?
Not really, not really, because they more or less improvised. And then I forget who was the bartender at the time, but I do remember seeing the jars of eggs and pig's feet and so on, behind the bar.
During the time when your father worked at Anaconda, how many years altogether did he work there? Do you know?
I couldn't tell you. I really couldn't tell you. Perhaps my brother Bill could tell you the years.
Were there any company-sponsored outings that your family went to? Were there picnics or anything?
Not that I remember. I remember that Zinzer's used to have outings, but since no one worked there, we didn't go. But we would hear about Zinzer's had outings. But I don't remember anything of the Anaconda ever doing anything like that.
Did your family all stay in Hastings, or did some of them move away?
My sister Ann moved to Yonkers, and she lived with the two Chemka girls. She lived in Yonkers, and she lived in Yonkers at the time we lived in Yonkers too, but she lived with the two Chemka girls. Joe, of course, when he finally came to America, we were living on Nepean in Yonkers, so he came there. And then he left the family and went to board at my Uncle Ben's house. He was taken in as a boarder there. Outside of Yonkers and Hastings, no, it wasn't until later that my brother's wife inherited a farm up in Ferndale, New York, and they took over the farm.
Which brother was that?
Joseph.
Uh-huh.
He's the one that came from Russia. They moved up to Ferndale until he died, until his death a few years ago. So my younger sister lived here in Hastings. Of course, she boarded out too. And then she went up to Ferndale as well as an anniversary party up there, and she met her future husband. And she married him in a matter of a few weeks until her death a couple of years ago. So more or less it was Hastings based, Hastings, and very little of Yonkers. We never liked Yonkers.
Do you remember hearing the whistle at home?
Oh, yes. Constant. 9 o'clock, we knew it was 9 o'clock.
Is this in the morning or at night?
At night. The curfew was 9 o'clock.
Tell me about the
You
curfew.
had to get home before that whistle blew, or your legs were broken.
By whom?
By your family. Oh, yes, we had a curfew. That was the 9 o'clock whistle. And then New Year's Eve at 12 o'clock, the whistles blew, and we got the pots and pans out and made noises. And, oh, yes, we remember the whistles.
Yeah. What did you think about it when you were a child. Well, is that the only whistle you remember? Is one at 9 o'clock at night?
9 o'clock at night and New Year's Eve.
Mhm.
New Year's Eve when we were awakened and given pots and pans and went out on the porch and banged on them and made a lot of noise. But outside of that, I don't remember the whistles.
You don't remember it in the daytime?
No. 12 o'clock. They blew the whistle. That was 12
Mm.
o'clock. That was lunchtime. And I don't know whether they blew it at 1 o'clock, which was the comeback time.
You
That I
just,
don't know.
you don't have a big awareness of it?
No,
then?
not awareness. If it blew, it blew. We knew what it was for and just paid no attention. Because remember, the men didn't carry watches.
Mm.
So they had to be told, when they would do that.
Once you were old enough to come off your block, was your life still centered around the neighborhood, or did you move around town more?
I moved around town more, and but I still love to visit the old neighborhood.
Well, weren't you still living, I'm talking about when you were a schoolboy. You still lived at home.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. But did you visit other parts of the town other than the school and your own
Oh
neighborhood?
yeah. Not too much. Well, I was a newsboy.
Ah.
I was a newspaper boy, so I had the route, and I took it over from my brother because he had other fish to fry.
Mhm.
So I did the news. I was Billy Burke's newsboy,
Ah.
and I remember looking into the dollhouse. Should I tell you the story about having to curtail her newspaper delivery?
Mm.
Because she owed the newspaper dealer all of $105. So we were told not to deliver to Billy Burke anymore. But I do remember Minor Watson, the actor, the stage actor, the movie actor, had the house up on top of Villard Hill. And, I knew quite the section of it because when I go to yard sales now, I say, I remember this house. I remember this house because I delivered newspapers here.
Mm.
And then the Riverview street there, when I had the newspaper route in the afternoon, I had the newspaper route there, so I remembered more or less. And we had this big strap that carried the newspapers, and this great big stack of newspapers.
What newspaper were you delivering? Was this a Yonkers?
The Herald
paper?
Statesman.
Uh-huh.
The Herald Statesman, yes.
Ah.
That's what it was. There was the Yonkers Herald, and there was the Statesman. And then they merged, and then it became the Herald Statesman. And we had, in Hastings, we had the Hastings News, and we had the Hastings Press.
Did you deliver those too?
No, they were more or less, I think you just bought them there, or they had their own delivery.
Mm-hmm.
But the Hastings News was located right where the attorney's office is on Main Street.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the Hastings News was located. And they had the big windows in front, and we could look in and see the printing presses and so on.
1, 2, 3, 4, testing.
8, and next door I see a red cap on our porch sitter, the fellow who sits on the porch every day, and he's got a nice swing there.
Being divided into different sections?
Oh, definitely. Oh, yes. I don't know whether it was we who didn't like the rich crowd or the rich crowd didn't like us, but there was segregation. Oh, definitely, yes. It was. Our families were the domestics to the rich, you see, who could afford them. And if we went to school with their children, of course, we were aware of the fact that our parents worked for these people. No, there was discrimination galore. The teachers, I remember the teachers always leaned toward the richer kids, as we say. We call them the rich kids. But the teachers always leaned toward them. We were sort of, just tolerated. No, there was quite a bit of that in the school.
Was it based primarily on economics, or was it based on ethnic groups, or?
I think economics, more or less. I wouldn't say so much the ethnic.
Mm-hmm.
But we always had one up on them because all the children spoke Russian and Polish. And when we got to school and we didn't like what they were doing, we came out with the Russian and Polish. And we always had a big laugh amongst ourselves, which was the others didn't like very much. But we would, criticize them in Russian and so on, everyone would laugh. So we were sort of getting back at them. No, but it was quite obvious with teachers too, that teachers' pets were all from the manor, we called it the manor, Riverview Manor it was called, and we knew that the teachers leaned toward them. I remember in kindergarten once when Miss Scott gave, I think it was Jenkins, Miss Jenkins was a teacher, and her son started school at the same time I did. And
Could you just tell me the date when you started school? Do you remember?
well, I was 5 years old, so that was 1928, I believe. It was September 1928. I still remember the first day. My sister Mary brought me to the school, and she left me alone in the kindergarten, and I was screaming. So they gave us a bunch of toys that sort of pacified us all. But it was the first time I was more or less away from home, away from the
Were
village.
any of the other children from the neighborhood in kindergarten with you? Did you have
Yes.
a friend?
Bill Shlyuk
Uh-huh.
was one of them. And some of the girls, I can't seem to remember the girl, but I do remember Bill Shlyuk. And Miss Scott was our kindergarten teacher, and I wanted to use the scooter. And we were up on the top floor of the school, that was the kindergarten. I wanted to use the scooter, and the Jenkins boy wanted the scooter too. And Miss Scott gave it to the Jenkins boy. And she said, well, Frank, you can't have it because he has rubber-soled shoes, and your leather shoes would make too much noise downstairs. So he was given the scooter. Oh, yes, it was...
Did you believe that?
No. If I didn't believe it and I didn't like it, because we knew the teachers leaned toward the rich kids.
When there were incidents like this, did you talk about it at home? Did you tell your parents?
No, we didn't tell the parents because they weren't too busy. They weren't too interested. We talked amongst ourselves and so on. And I do remember discussing with my sister Mary because we were very close, and mentioning things that the teacher said, and Mary would say, oh, your teacher's crazy. And I said, well, I'm going to tell her that. And my sister would say, go ahead and tell her. But yes, we were quite aware of the fact that they treated the rich kids much better. I don't know about the marks that they gave us or what, but they didn't show too much tolerance toward us. They didn't extend themselves to us. If we didn't understand something, I don't remember they ever wanting to help us with the problems that we had.
Were there exceptions to this? Were there any teachers that you felt were really for you?
Not really. Not really. There weren't any teachers that you fell madly in love with because they were so good to you. I do remember there was a Frances Ryan in the 3rd grade. She was, I think, she didn't live in Hastings, so it didn't matter to her. But I think she was perhaps one of the first teachers that showed me a little help. She showed me a little warmth. But outside of that, we had Miss Jenkins was one, and Miss Kempton was another one. Miss Joyce was another teacher.
These are all in elementary school you're talking about?
These are all in the elementary. Miss Stark was my 1st grade teacher. Miss Rice, or Miss Scott, or Miss Rice was the kindergarten teacher at the time. I might have the 2 names mixed up. I think it was Miss Scott, I think so. But it didn't bother us too much because we grew up knowing that the rich kids were not with us.
What was the proportion in the school? Were there more of what you're calling the rich kids, or were there more of you and your contemporaries?
No, I would say 50-50.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say they were outnumbered and so on. But I do remember one time, I think it was in the 2nd grade, the 3rd grade or 2nd grade, when they started to interest us in banking. And they took us down to the bank, and told us we could all open accounts, personal accounts. And I opened mine with 5 cents. And all the other kids brought 5 cents, and they were all given bank books for 5 cents. And I remember over the period, I made it all the way to 25 cents. But Beale Foster's mother, the first day, Beale Foster's mother gave him $100 to open his account. So that's how we knew who the rich kids were and who the poor kids were. When we wore hand-me-down shoes, the rich kids let us know that they knew they were hand-me-downs, and they ridiculed us. They weren't very nice. They were very, very what they call snotty, and even later on when I went to junior and senior high, it was still discrimination. It was still, we down near the tracks. And I was never ashamed of the fact, because I thought my friends were a lot nicer, a lot more honest and so on, a lot more companionable than the English kids were. They were given everything, and they let us know that they got everything.
You mean at home or at school?
Home. And when they needed anything at school, they got that. They had the biggest pencil boxes. When they came to school, they were given the best pads and pencils and so on. So we knew that they were rich kids that way, and they let us know it. They came to school all dressed up. The girls came with pretty big bows on their heads, and our kids, the parents couldn't afford big bows, so the girls didn't wear bows. It was lucky they could buy a comb.
Do you remember anything about what you studied in elementary school?
I do remember penmanship. That's where I got my penmanship, I can correct today, is the Parker method used. And how we tried terribly to get used to it, and we were told about the wrist motion and so on. And then I do remember the first time we had mathematics, and we learned addition by the cards. The teacher would hold up the card, and it was subtraction or addition and so on. And we all had to stand, and she would show the card, and you gave when your turn came, you were given the total, whatever it was, and then you sat down and the next person got. Then we had spelling, and I remember I was a very good speller. So that I remember too. We didn't care too much for geography. That was sort of stumped us. That meant those big technical books and the maps and so on. We couldn't read those. And then there was history. I remember in the 3rd grade, we had history, and I remembered hearing about the teacher pronounced it Ponte de Leon, who went to look for the eternal youth. Magellan, the Straits of Magellan. I remember history quite a bit. What other subjects were there? We didn't have science at that time. It was too early for us. But basically, those were the reading, writing, and arithmetic. And music. Oh, yes, I remember music, too. We had the little song books, and the teacher would come along, and you would have to say, fa, sol, la, ti, do, and she would listen to you, and I didn't know one note from the other, and I didn't know what the hell she was talking about. But there was music classes too. And then on some mornings, I don't remember what mornings they were, we were marched into the auditorium, and this great big Atwater Kent radio was on the stage. And Walter Damrush had a program that was for children. And we all sat in the auditorium and listened to the music program with Walter Damrush. And then when our music teacher were giving us songs to learn, I remembered the other day, and I thought, why does this come back? I hated the song so much. Moon dear, sun dear. And we just hated that song. And then we had the Row, Row, Row Your Boat, and we had another song called Oh No John, No John, No John, No. That was another round where the girls sang one part and the boys sang another part. So But I do remember I was quite mixed up in school with music. And then I was always cast in these musicals that we gave. The first part I remember is an Indian in a blanket. And how later on I found out that the thing was so funny. When we all got out on the stage, everyone just kept giggling and giggling and giggling. And we not only giggled, but the audience would giggle too because they recognized us. And the porter would have to run down with the mop because they all got hysterical and wet themselves.
Were you ever taken on excursions from school down to the river at all?
Down to the Museum of Natural History and the museum, and to the Bronx Zoo. I do remember the Bronx Zoo because the lions frightened me. Just as we came in the cage, he was this great big lion roaring and just terrified me. The Bronx Zoo and the Museum of Natural History. I remember we had to brown bag our lunch. We had to bring our lunch. And but that was just about all I remember.
You never went, did you study the river at all, the Hudson River?
No, we just swam in it. We just swam in it. That was all we know. We did discover the Palisades at an early age because school told us that it was a mystery. It was one of the 7 wonders of the world, the Palisades. Why the Palisades, such a sheer drop of rock on one side and nothing on this side? So they tried to tell us perhaps the river was higher than it is now. And the Palisades on the side melted or whatever it was. But we were given a few lessons about the Hudson River.
Never taken down there as a school excursion?
No, I guess it was too close. You know, I mean, we had to be taken into New York, but to the Hudson River, no. We swam in it, so we knew the river.
What about when you were in high school? What kinds of subjects did you take then? Did you take a foreign language?
French. French. I had the choice of either Latin or French, and I chose French. Subjects, I wasn't too good a scholar. It seems that you just had to go through school because it was required. But in my later years, I realized that I had to have an education. So I boned up on everything. In my last couple of years, I went back for a postgraduate course. In my last few years, I didn't have any study hall to speak of. I just took all subjects I could. And I took up typing, I took up a shorthand at night school to just catch up on.
At night school where?
We had night school. No.
In Hastings?
In Hastings, right, and I took shorthand. Because it was, since the typing, you know, and you needed shorthand too.
Did you ever use that later?
No, I didn't, because I got very ill and I dropped out of the class. I remember another subject in junior high was bookkeeping that we took. And then in my later years, I came to Miss Jones as my English teacher, and that's where I learned to speak English. She took those D's, Dems, and Do's out of us. She taught me what a double negative in a sentence is. She told me how to conjugate a verb and how to punctuate a sentence. Otherwise, we didn't know from nothing. But she taught me all that. She would quote Shakespeare. I didn't know what the hell Shakespeare was or what she was talking about. But when I left school, I was perhaps her best Shakespearean student because I went to see every Shakespeare play and I could quote to her from different Shakespeare. Today, people ask me, what line is this from what Shakespeare play? And I can tell them who said it and in what play.
Was she your favorite teacher?
She was the best teacher in the world. She was the best teacher in the world. I didn't much care for her when she taught us. I didn't much care. But then suddenly, you know, the light comes, and you suddenly realize that this woman is a magician and she is teaching you something that you never knew before. And she just opened new vistas to you. She knew how to teach. That I will say. She knew how to teach. She didn't teach by force, or she didn't threaten or anything. If you didn't understand anything and she handed you a paper back with a big NG on it because there was nothing on it, she didn't fail you. Because as she said to me, you might not have been learning anything, but at least you gave someone else a chance to learn. You were quiet. You tried to. And I said, this all comes back to me. After I left school, it all came back to me. The penmanship, the English, the conjugating verbs, double negatives, and so on. So she understood that people retain knowledge. Don't necessarily absorb it then, but they retain that knowledge.
Did you have any favorite teachers whom you liked better than others?
There was, as I say, in the 3rd grade, there was Francis Ryan. No, I didn't have, say, favorite teachers. They weren't, even my contemporaries today will tell you, the teachers weren't very sociable to us. They couldn't come to our homes, perhaps, as they could with the rich kids and so on. But I remember there was a Miss Schinnebarger, and she was not nice at all. She was almost cruel. There was a Miss Polhemus, and she wasn't very nice either. Who else in the teachers? Everyone claims that Coach Cochran, was the best teacher and so on, but I found him a bit sadistic. I didn't like him at all. I found him a bit sadistic. He pushed the boys into the activities. It was more or less, get out there and win. Nothing else will do to win. You see, he pushed that down their throats. And I found him a bit sadistic. I didn't like Coach Cochran at all. When we had substitute physical training teachers, we got along fine. But Coach Cochran, I had no use for at all.
Interesting. Were you given any kind of vocational guidance in high school?
It wasn't until, as I say, my last few years in junior high or senior high that Dean Smith sort of took a liking to me, and she tried to guide me. And I said, she tried her hardest to get me to go to college. My family nixed that because of the problems at home. We needed the money, more or less. And she tried to get me to go to college. She wanted to talk to my family about going. And all I remember there saying is, no, we need the money, go to work at the Anaconda. That was the place to go, the Anaconda, nowhere else. In an office or anywhere else, you went to work at the Anaconda. I didn't want to work at the Anaconda in the factory. But Dean Smith tried her darndest to get me to go to college. And I said, there's no way could I go. There were no finances.
What about your friends? How were they encouraged by the school to go to college?
No,
or
no.
what kinds of jobs were they encouraged to go to do?
More or less the Anaconda.
Really?
Yeah, when you were graduating, you were left to go to the Anaconda. Or if you had a chance to work somewhere else, if you were able to, through a relative, to get a job somewhere else, you were allowed to go to work there. But otherwise, nothing else was the Anaconda. That was it. There was no college. The rich kids were all going to college. They talked about that. But we couldn't. We didn't have the finances. So it wasn't until out on my own that I finally, decided what I was going to do and so on. But I had no guidance. Let's say it wasn't due to no guidance at the school. It was just, it was a puzzlement at the time. I didn't know what I was going to do, what I was qualified for, or what I could do. So when I went to work in the beginning, it was all new to me.
What did you do when you got out of school?
When I went to work as a messenger at Otis Elevator. There was a choice Dean Smith called Charles, I forget his name, and myself up into her office, and she said, there's an opening at the Anaconda. And I'm sending both Charles Gingham, Gingham, I think his name was, Bingham, Charles Bingham. Both of us were sent down to the Anaconda for the job in the office, and Charlie was chosen. And then I was sent to Otis for the interview, and it seemed that I was just what they were looking for in that job. So they called me messenger, but I was more or less an escort. It was the beginning of the war, 1941, the beginning of the war. And they were having a very closed shop with identifications and so on. And I was an escort for visitors. I was taken to the office they were to visit, nowhere else. See, so I was more or less back and forth. And then I had other little things to do here and there. But then after they found out I wasn't going into the Army, they classified me as 4F. They took me into the factory for a government job. So I worked there.
In Anaconda?
No, in Otis.
Oh, at Otis.
Yeah, because they were doing war work. They were making ammunition racks. They were great big racks that circled. And the ammunition was put in, and it was pushed into the gun. It was dropped into the gun and so on. I worked on those. They thought I was the only intelligent one there, intelligent enough to work on a government project like that. Then I went into the music business, into a record shop, because I discovered music. I was just crazy about music. In my childhood, I didn't know music. We didn't have a radio. It wasn't until 1932, 1933 that my sister brought a radio home. And I didn't understand radio, except that when you turned it on, there was music came out. And then the boys all had their favorite programs in the mornings, and while we were eating breakfast, we would have the music on. And I learned the words to all the songs. And I knew all the songs that they played. I would sing it along. And my sister called to my attention. She said, "You know every word to all the songs." And I said, "Yes." So that helped later on in retaining, I just absorbed it. And then I remembered. And music became a field, so I went into the music business after that.
And you enjoyed that?
Yes, that was, I thought, more or less my life. But then again, there was the food business too. Mama was a rotten cook. She cooked because she had to, but she wasn't the best cook in the world. They cooked very heavy, fried everything in grease, and so on. It wasn't very, what will I say, tasty. So, and she cooked the way she cooked and so on. And later on, when I told her I was going to teach her how to fry an egg, she said, "I've been frying eggs for 32 years. And I said, "It's time you learned how to do it correctly." And she said, "I'd like to hit you on the head with this frying pan." But I took up cooking because, as I say, Mom was such a she was such a rotten cook. So I finally took over cooking, and that's more or less the field I went into as well.
When you were growing up, did your family belong to a church?
Oh yes, Stanislaus. I remember they took me to Stanislaus Church. It was snowing, and my father carried me on the shoulders, and they muffled me in a big blue scarf, and all showing were my eyes. And they brought me to church, and being a child of 3 or 4 years old, that isn't the time you bring a child to church. And I had the scarf around me, and it was warm, and I fell asleep in the pew. So that was all I remember about church until later on when I made my communion. But it was all Stanislaus, christenings, weddings, and all.
Is this also the same church that your friends and neighbors went to?
Well, of our religion. Like the Shapuras and the Harinyushas and so on. But then the other group were Russian, so they went to the Russian church. And that was in Yonkers, you see. And then the Italians went to more or less St. Matthew's as well.
Did St. Stanislaus provide any kinds of services for your community?
We went to catechism.
But I mean, besides religious things, were there any social programs?
Oh yes, they had dances under the church. They have a hall under the church. They had, say, Saturday night dances, more or less, and they would have an accordionist, and very little more. Perhaps maybe my father with his violin or his bubin, his tambourine. But we made do. And since our families never heard of babysitters, we were brought to these things. And of course, we enjoyed them in the beginning until we tired out, and then we fell asleep in the chairs, and until our families were ready to go home.
Mm-hmm. Were all the masses done in Polish? Or Russian? Or?
Latin.
They were Latin?
I think they were done in Latin.
Well, what about the sermon? I mean,
the sermon was in Polish.
Mm-hmm.
The sermon was after Mass was over. The sermon was in Polish.
Yeah.
And I remember Father Daskowitz was never a very happy priest. He never spread the good word. He constantly berated the parishioners.
Must have sent you home feeling good.
No, I never had anything nice to say about Father Daskowitz. I'm sorry. I said that recently at a wedding to someone who thought he was the greatest, and she told me it was a sin to talk that way about the priest, and I said, he wasn't a priest, really. He was, people in town didn't like him at all. The children, when he walked down the street in his black hat and his black suit, the children used to point and say, here comes the black spider. Now, you don't say those things about a gentle priest. But Father Daskowitz was not like, he used to beat us when we didn't know our catechism lessons. And not just beat us this way, but with a plank bent over a table and whopped a few times. And if you didn't know your lesson, that's what you got. I mean, and he was not light-handed with this. It was a good wallop. I remember Mary Waryha. She was swacked, and but good. And my cousin Charles Waryha, the same way. They couldn't learn these things in Polish. They just couldn't get them. But that was no excuse. We were just beaten.
Did the church provide any kind of social services for families who might be in need, or anything beyond just religious services?
That was all.
Okay, still all right there. The church then really, did it just serve one ethnic group?
The Polish.
Uh-huh.
Polish. Because the masses I know were in Latin. And my brother Charles served as altar boy at one time, and then my cousin served as altar boy.
You never did?
No, he tried to get me into it, but that was at the time I was leaving the church. I didn't believe him. I didn't believe his rules. He was telling us things that were unbelievable, that went far beyond religious teachings. This man was fabricating, shall I say, and saying that this was the church, this was religion, and so on, which wasn't true. Father Daskowitz never had nuns in the church. They had nuns in St. Matthew's. They had nuns in other churches. He didn't have them in St. Stanislaus. He just didn't want them.
When you were a child. Where did you play? Did you play in the neighborhood or something?
In the neighborhood. In the neighborhood. I remember Ridge Street was more or less our territory, and we didn't have cars at that time. They weren't on Ridge Street. Perhaps a wig and the junk man or the old clothes man was allowed on with his horse and wagon, but I don't remember any cars there. So we played on Ridge Street. We played marbles. I remember marbles. I wasn't very good at that. And they played baseball, and they played games like 50 scatter, tag. The girls jumped rope. They played hopscotch. Ring Around the Rosies. I remember the All Fall Down, and the London Bridges falling down, and so on. That was when everyone joined. And then, what did I say? Those were the games we played.
Was there a playground? Or
No, Ridge Street was our
Ridge
playground.
Street was your
Was our
playground.
playground. We had a playground, but we went there during school times, more or less, when Coach Cochran took us to play games at Reynolds Field.
Mhm.
That was when we went there. And if they did have games, we would go up on, whenever they had them, Sunday afternoon and so on, we would sit on the grass and watch the games. But our playground was Ridge Street and Railroad Avenue, which is now Southside Avenue. We played 50 scatter there. And as I say, we had fun. We weren't mischievous. We didn't destroy properties. We didn't break things. We didn't steal. We just played. So I say, my childhood, outside of not having money, and having everything, we were happy. We had games. We went out to play. We had friends, and we enjoyed ourselves.
Who were your playmates?
My cousin, Charles Waryha, was the playmate. Bill Shuluk, the other Shuluk brothers, the Kowalczyk boys, the Grachowski boys. I can't remember half the names. But you see, we lived in 3 Washington, which was a big apartment building, and there was 8 Washington, which is another big apartment building. So all the kids, we all played together.
All different ages?
All different ages, yeah. Not the exceptionally young and not the exceptionally older ones. The older ones went off somewhere and did, but our contemporaries, we all played together.
Did boys and girls play together at all?
Not too much, because the boys perhaps a little too wild. But I do remember every time we played 50 scatter, the girls were always jumping rope. They were always jumping rope.
Did you ever take vacations?
Our vacations were the street.
I mean,
During summer
your
vacation.
family never went away anywhere.
No, we didn't have anywhere to go. It wasn't until my sister married up to Ferndale, and then I'd take my summer vacations, but that was when I was going to senior high and junior high and so on. But we didn't take vacations. Occasionally we were taken on outing to Tibbetts Park for the swimming. They had a pool there.
How did you get there?
A trolley.
Mm-hmm.
Trolley. Because we didn't have cars, so we went by trolley. The number 1, which was here on Warburton, took you into Getty Square, and then you took the number, I forget what number it was, I think number 6, right on Yonkers Avenue, and you walked to Tibbetts. So we were taken on an outing. My father had a box where Mama had made sandwiches, lunch, and that was it. We would have a picnic. Now on Tibbetts, on the aqueduct, adjoining Tibbetts pool and so on, up above, they had these ethnic groups that had outings, and they would hang their flag to show what group this was. And there were the Italians, they had one group and so on. They had musicians, they had planks, and they served beer, they served liquors, they served food, hot dogs and so on. And you went where your flag was hanging, and that was where you went. And it was Russian, mostly accordionists, and maybe a balalaika or so would play the Russian dances and so on. And you could just get out there and dance. There was no admission, it was just a group, but they made money on the food and the drink that they served. So that was our Sunday outings. And when we lived in Yonkers, we took the trolley down to Tibbetts Park on Sundays, and that was our outing there too. But it had nothing to do with the church. The church didn't extend themselves in any way. And I often blame Father Daskowitz for that, because he was not an outgoing priest. He just there to teach religion, and that was it. But he never extended himself to people. If he had fault to find, he would call the family in and let them know what it was. But outside of that, he did not extend himself as a religious man. We did not have religious teachings as such. We were given Mass, and that was it. No, our religion at the time was not good. It was not, let's say, religious teaching. It was Father Daskowitz's teaching. But let's get off that. But,
You mentioned earlier swimming in the river. Did you do that a lot?
oh, yes, every day during the summer.
Mhm.
That was our vacation. We swam in the river.
Was there any adult supervision, or did you?
No supervision, but everyone looked out for everyone else.
Where on the waterfront did you swim? Was there one particular place
Oh,
you'd
yeah,
go?
it was the Point, they called it. The Point. It was, it's blocked off now, I understand. I think the boathouse is there now.
Mhm.
But then they used to have a great big abandoned ship they called the junk boat. That was there for the longest time. And during the war, they cut it up and sold the metal. They needed the metal, so they cut that up. But the junk boat was there, and we walked a little further down toward the Point. And there were different sections where people, well, I like this point better, and I would hear there. And then we had our bathing beauties. We had them out there, you know, with their bathing suits on and showing off their figures and so on, and sun tanning themselves on the rocks and so on. Oh yeah, so we were down there every day.
Were there large groups of people
Oh
who lived
yes,
there?
oh yes. The whole stretch was all people,
Uh-huh.
and we all swam. And I won't tell you what floated by us as far as sewage went, but we just did this with our hands and just pushed it all away and swam. And today we talk about the pool and we say, you know, I remember the river, and they say, yes, none of us died of it. And I say, not that we know. We could have died, someone could have died of pollution that we didn't know. They didn't diagnose as such. But the river was polluted. It was filthy.
Did you belong to any athletic clubs or teams or?
No, we didn't have any as such. I was not an athletic person. I was a sickly child, asthmatic. And when I took athletics in school, I found that when I got home I was exhausted and brought on attacks and so on. So after a while I had to drop athletics. But I did enjoy volleyball. I enjoyed the different races that we had, the running, the Olympic races with the pick up the baton, you know, and run with it, and dodgeball, and so on. Those I enjoyed in my early years, but the doctor said it's not doing you any good, so I had to drop school, drop athletics. But our other athletics were the games we played. We learned to swim in the Hudson. My brother took me out over my head and just left me there, and he said, swim back. And that's the way we learned to swim. You paddle like crazy to stay above water, and you learn to swim.
Were you a member of any social clubs or organizations?
We didn't have any as such. We didn't have any social clubs, so to say. The South Side Club, as such, was, I think, just the beginning of young people's clubs, and I didn't belong to that. But
Did your brothers?
my brothers both did.
Do
In
they
fact,
still?
I think Bill is still a member. I don't know whether Charles, he lives in Dobbs Ferry now. I don't know whether he is now, but they are. But I think that was the only so-called club that we had at the beginning of the South Side. And I was too young when that started. I was too young when it started, and then later on, when I bought the house and I was working in Yonkers and so on, I sort of got away from the South Side Club. I never joined.
What were the favorite places for socializing? I know you mentioned
Skis.
Did your family ever go out to eat, or?
Oh, no.
No.
We couldn't afford it.
Uh-huh.
We couldn't afford restaurants as such. I don't remember restaurants as such. It was you either dined at friends' or cousins' homes. You either went there or they came to your house and so on. But restaurants, no, restaurants were not. I don't remember entering a restaurant until when my sister Anne would take us to the circus to New York and so on, then she would take us to a restaurant. And I marveled that there were places like this to eat. But I think the only restaurant I remember was the Farragut Inn. That was the restaurant. And then we had a diner, which was on almost on the corner of Washington and Warburton.
What was it
one of
called?
those A diner, a real, one of those car diners, that type of thing. They had a diner there, and then we had...
Did it have a name, or was it just called
No,
the
just
diner?
called the diner. And then there was Nana's Lunch, which was John Boker's place, so that was a restaurant too. But we didn't eat there.
What about at this place you call Skis? Was there food served there?
At occasions, at weddings,
Uh-huh.
different occasions that they had, dances they had, and so.
Who sponsored the dances?
It was more or less the club.
I
club
see.
at the time.
Mm-hmm.
The Southside Club would have one. Then the Polish League would have one. Then, say, the Russian Cooperative would have a dance on Saturday. That was for the older Russian people.
Were these open to everybody?
Well,
the
you
dances?
bought a ticket.
Uh-huh.
Oh, you bought a
But
ticket.
anybody could go?
Oh, yeah, sure. If you bought a ticket, you were allowed in.
Uh-huh.
And then you bought your food separately.
Did your family go to these
Oh, yeah,
things?
sure. We all did.
Uh-huh.
We all did, yeah. We loved them. As children, we went, because we never heard of babysitters, so we all went to these things. Oh, no, I remember fun as we knew it. Fun as we knew it. But not just being children, we just ran. We didn't dance or anything. We just ran around the hall, made nuisances of ourselves.
You've talked about swimming on the river. Did you ever go boating or use the river for anything else besides swimming?
No, I wouldn't say, only occasionally when someone came along with a rowboat, that was our boating. Once or twice we took the outing boat up to Bear Mountain and back again, but we very rarely went on that.
Did you go fishing at all? Did anybody in your family go fishing?
I've been fishing once, and I caught a little tiny fish, and I threw it back, and that was it. As far as fishing or crabbing went or anything. I didn't have the patience to sit there for hours and waiting for some stupid fish to come along and bite.
What about your father or your brothers? Did they
My
fish?
brothers did. My brothers did. They went crabbing, they went fishing, they brought the fish home, the crabs home, and so on.
Off Hastings, did they do this?
Yes, down here at the Anaconda, the dock at the Anaconda. And that's where the older boys swam, the dock at the Anaconda.
What kind of fish did they catch, do you know?
Perch mostly, perch and eels.
Eels?
Eels. And when we caught them, you knew that what you were going to have for supper that night.
Mm-hmm. Oh, your mother did use the fish.
Oh, yeah, sure. Eels were delicacy.
Who cleaned the fish?
The
mother?
The boys or the mother,
Mm-hmm.
they cleaned it because they knew from Russia too how to clean fish and, how to prepare it too.
If fish weren't caught by members of your family, was there any place in town you could buy locally caught fish from the Hudson?
Oh, yeah. When you went to the market, they would have fish there too.
But was it caught in the river here?
That I don't know. I don't
Uh-huh.
think so. I don't think so. I think it was bought from, whatever we caught, we ate.
How did you get to the river? I know you walked, but what path did you take? Do you remember?
Well, we went down over the bridge where the station is, railroad station is. We went over that bridge, turned to the right, and walked along the tracks. I remember walking along the tracks, the balancing act and so on. And we walked down and we walked back. There was no way you could ride because it was all sort of blocked off for traffic. So if you had a car, it was just down the hill over that bridge, and you had to leave the car there, and you walked the rest of it because we were all...
When you went down there, Frank, did you have any awareness of the industry that was down there? Did you think about it and
No.
see people going in and out?
We saw people going in and out because the bridge was right outside our window on Washington Avenue. Now, the bridge was all the way up Washington, all the way up to where the bookstore is now.
Mm-hmm.
And when we looked out the window, we saw all these people going over the bridge, walking over the bridge to go to work. And they went over the tracks on the bridge and down that steep staircase to the Anaconda. And that's where we were conscious of the Anaconda, yes, because of the times the people, the whistles blowing and so on. And then when the trains came, and the whole house shook when the trains came. They're freight trains. And we slept through it. After a while, you got so used to when the freight train came, you just slept right through it. But we were conscious of the industry there because starting work and coming home from work, it was en masse. All these people coming over the bridges and so on. Mostly walking. So we were conscious of the Zinzers we liked most of all because they were generous. They were generous to the families. Then at Easter time and Christmas time, I think when the union came in, they started giving out hams at the holidays. I think the union started that because I don't remember my father ever bringing a ham home, but I do remember the boys bringing the hams home. So I think the union started that. But Zinzers was always, we knew them as generous at the time. They were always given baskets of food and things like that.
You talked about having to push aside debris while you were swimming. Were you aware of the company or the village dumping into the river at all?
No, we thought it came off the outing boats, more or less.
Uh-huh.
We thought it came from the boats. We weren't aware of their dropping raw sewage into the river, although we saw the pipes, coming down with the water trickling down and so on. So, but it didn't bother us so much. It was dirty. It was dirty.
What about landfill? Were you aware of landfill going in along the river?
No.
No.
That we never saw here. The landfill, more or less, the only landfill I would think about was the junk boat, which was put there, and then they more or less started to put in dirt and so on and make sort of like a dock there. But that would be the only landfill as such.
Did you like living that close to the river? Was that something that you were actively
Yeah, it was
interested in?
Oh, we'd all have loved to live at the manor in those lovely homes. When we got automobile rides and we rode around and we saw these lovely homes, we would all love to have lived in a home like that. But since we couldn't have it, we didn't envy. We didn't want to steal the thing. If we couldn't have it, we couldn't have it. That's what we did without.
Were you aware of the seasons changing in terms of the river?
Oh, yeah.
How did it change?
When it was too cold to swim, we didn't go to the river anymore. We more or less played our games. We roller skated a lot. And at the time, they were tearing up what is now the parking plaza. They called that the plaza. There were houses around there on the side, which is now Factory Lane. There were houses along that lining. And they were tearing all that down. They tore the houses down, and they were building this plaza. It was, I don't know why they ever built that, because we didn't have that many automobiles. But they just built this plaza. I think more or less it's I don't know, maybe picnic grounds or whatever. But there were cars starting to park around there. But I do remember that it was more or less just houses there, and they were torn down. And we roller skated at the plaza when they built it, and then we would come down Spring Street, come down on our roller skates, which was death-defying, but we came down. And we also made the boxes with the roller skates, you know. That was more or less fall activities. And then when it snowed, we went sleigh riding.
Where did you go sleigh riding?
Sleigh riding on Washington Hill. The very, very brave, from the top of Washington Hill, there was no traffic light on Warburton, so some kids would stand there and motion for them to come down because there was no traffic. In those days, we didn't have that many cars, and they didn't park along Washington Avenue as they do today. There was just no parking, there were no cars. So they would signal, come on down, and all of a sudden this whole team of sleighs would come down across Warburton and down the rest of Washington.
That was death-defying, wasn't it?
Death-defying, right. But you see, if you were watching for traffic and all, and they were coming with the sleigh, you held up traffic. We just held up our hands like this and held up traffic.
How did you stop the sleigh?
You didn't stop the sleigh, you stopped the traffic.
Oh.
Came right across Warburton, from the top of Washington, right across Warburton, down to the other part of Washington.
Did your mother know you were doing these things?
Oh, the mothers just said they were out sleigh riding, that's all. That's all they knew we were doing. You know.
Do you visit the waterfront today?
I occasionally, when I can get down that far. I was down a couple of years ago, and I saw where they built the boathouse and so on. I love to visit the riverfront. Yes.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, how do you feel about it and the changes?
Memories.
and-
Memories.
Mhm.
I'm very anti-pollution, and I just shake my head at what they're doing to a beautiful river. In those days, it was just a place for us to swim, but today it's pollution-riddled, and I feel it's a crime because we love the Hudson. We were brought up on the Hudson, and we love the Hudson. And I just love Hastings. That's why I bought the house here 45 years ago. And I'm very happy, retired here. And, when I was buying the house, they would say, well, suppose this and suppose that. And I said, well, no, I want to live in Hastings. I want to retire and live in Hastings.
That's great.
I thought so.
Well, I thank you very much.
Oh,
I've